Hello and welcome to the Cesspool, and more importantly, welcome to Committed, the series that gives me the excuse to talk about one of my own guilty pleasures, old psychiatric hospitals. Now I know this is a huge step away from the usual content here on the Cesspool, but give it a try, and you might just like it. Today our story starts in the town of Poughkeepsie, New York, which is about 60 miles north of Manhattan in the scenic Hudson River Valley. The state of New York was in the process of looking for a new location for their second state-run psychiatric hospital, considering that the first, located in Utica, New York, had become overcrowded after the Civil War. The governor of New York at the time, Reuben Fenton, had appointed a team to find a suitable location for this facility in 1866. By January of 1867, the team had returned to the governor with the good news that they had confirmed a massive 296-acre plot of land. This land was positioned high in the hills north of the aforementioned Poughkeepsie and was owned by William A. Davis and James Roosevelt I. Now that second name should sound familiar. James Roosevelt I was the father of American President Franklin Delano Roosevelt, who was the fifth cousin of President Teddy Roosevelt. I swear the Roosevelt family tree deserves a video in itself, but I don't think I have the brainpower to make it. Anyway, the new campus was secured and the funding was designated for the building of the facility. This money would be provided as a gift from the people of Dutchess County, New York, to the state. The governor appointed a board of managers to oversee and find architects for the project. The master plan for the building was put together by Frederick Clark Withers, an English architect who came to America in the 1850s. He had designed a number of buildings already in the New York area, however this was to be his masterpiece. A 500,000 square foot Kirkbride building with signature Kirkbride wing boards designed to care for 500 patients comfortably, and an administration building in the center. This building was incredibly impressive architecturally, as it was the first institutional building in the United States to take advantage of the high Victorian Gothic architectural style. The building itself wasn't the only thing that was to be extravagant, however. This board of managers wanted the grounds to be pristine and beautiful. They hired Calvert Vaux and Frederick Law Olmsted to design the landscape for the 296-acre property. Now, these weren't just two architects of the time, however. No. The board of managers only wanted the absolute best for this new facility. Vaux and Olmsted were the world-renowned architects behind New York City's Central Park. With the plans drawn up, the ground was broken in 1868. Almost immediately, the hospital's management began to be criticized even before the building was completed. Things started off on the wrong foot from the get-go. The hospital officially opened in 1871, however the only building completed at the time was the administration building. This was bad enough, but the building had already deviated from the approved plans by the state government. That year, only 7 patients were admitted to the hospital. By the next year, the price of construction had exceeded $1 million, and the building couldn't even care for half of its proposed patient count, with only 212 beds in the unfinished structure. The hospital management was criticized by the state for the amount of money spent, as well as what little to show for it. By 1873, the people of Dutchess County, who had supplied the money to build the hospital, expected it to be finished as was in the initial proposal. This was only a pipe dream, as the administration of the hospital continued to change the building plans, build new buildings, and spend more money than was ever necessary. They argued that new labor laws put in place after the Civil War were the cause of the extravagant expenses. Right. The hospital was gaining so much attention from this mismanagement, as well as the cost overruns, that the New York Times actually ran a story, and it certainly did not help to paint the hospital as anything but incompetent. It's a quote from that article titled "An Astonishing Job" from July 4th of 1873. The managers have entirely disregarded the law by which they were authorized to act. They have altered the plans and specifications. For some of the details of the extravagance of the board are amazing. For instance, the first part of the work undertaken was the construction of a reservoir, into which the water was pumped from the river through an 8-inch iron pipe. From the reservoir to the water was carried to the hospital by a 12-inch pipe. The engine and machinery employed was on the scale of those used in supplying a neighboring city of 20,000 inhabitants. The cost of the reservoir was $100,000. $30,000 was expended in blasting some rough rocks jutting into the reservoir, and the superintendent made as a reason for this that if some of the patients were missing, they might want to rake the bottom of the reservoir to find the bodies, and with this the rocks would interfere. The floors are laid in yellow southern pine, the most expensive of the flooring, fitted and cut in a way greatly to enhance the cost. The heating is arranged on a scale that, with only 150 patients, 10 tons of coal per day is consumed. The mention of these items sufficiently explains the disappearance of $1.2 million of the people's money. At this rate, the committee reports that the hospital will cost no less than $3 million and perhaps as much as $4 million. Even with all of these issues and efforts in and out of government to just pull the plug on the project, the state continued to pour money into the property to complete the master plan. They seized funding in 1898, 30 years after construction began, and with the master plan for the Kirkbride never realized. Now, while all of this construction was going on, the hospital was continuing to operate and attempting to innovate and develop its practices. They promoted patient self-reliance through activities such as farming, which was operated entirely by patients and supplied 2/3 of the hospital's food supply. They also encouraged activities such as the production of soap and basket weaving. This was all in following the ideology of moral and occupational treatments still being developed during the time. In 1886, the hospital started its day school program, which gave school education to the patients as a way to relieve them of the mundane life of living at the hospital. Along with patient education, the hospital opened its nursing school, which offered a 3-year program including internships, as well as a college-level courses and degrees for students. In 1893, the hospital came under scrutiny by the State Department of Mental Health because of its overspending on resources and unnecessarily higher standards for products compared to other institutions. This only further concluded to state officials that the hospital's administration was overspending for themselves and not the benefit of the hospital itself. As State Senator Charles P. McClellan stated, "I think the resident officers lived extravagantly, like so many lords." They brought in Dr. Charles W. Pilgrim to replace the original superintendent, Dr. Cleveland, who had resigned from his position following the investigation into hospital spending. Dr. Cleveland was not directly blamed for the investigation, but did put blame on himself. Now, Dr. Pilgrim, who was a veteran from Willard State Hospital, took the position of superintendent to find that many of the claims made by his predecessor involving overcrowding were entirely false. The hospital would take in another 300 patients that year, and under Dr. Pilgrim, the hospital increased its capacity greatly with the rearrangement of patient occupation in different buildings on the property. Women were exclusively treated in the incomplete Kirkbride, while men were treated for both in the Kirkbride and in 4 additional block buildings designed by Withers and built in 1889. Now, smaller cottages were added on the property to further increase capacity during this time as well. And Dr. Pilgrim was able to bring up the capacity to 1,500 patients, an unreal number at the time. These aren't the only positive implementations of Dr. Pilgrim, however. He installed electric lighting inside the facility and even convinced the state to continue construction on the north wing for female patients at the Kirkbride. It was completed in 1898, however deviated greatly from the original design and went well over its $125,000 budget. About par for the course at this point, really. Another strange controversy I thought should be noted towards the end of the 19th century came in the form of the East Shore Railroad. Now, to set the scene, Hudson River State Hospital had its coal shipped for $6,000 a year from the nearest railroad. To reduce costs, they constructed the East Shore directly to the hospital to try to save on money. After spending $74,000 to acquire the land and build the line, the railroad began to raise its rates of shipment to the point where it became more economical for the hospital not to use it at all. And the hospital filed an official complaint, however the state sided with the railroad on the issue. With the turn of the century, Hudson River State Hospital began to experiment and pioneer in what would later be known as hydrotherapy. They would force patients into baths filled with hot water where they were forced to stay for weeks or even months without being allowed to get out. They were given incredibly small portions of food, and the baths themselves were covered so that the patients couldn't leave. Dr. Pilgrim and the hospital in general got a lot of controversial press over this issue, including several newspaper articles criticizing the treatment method. In 1904, the hospital staff petitioned to form a union which fought for better wages for the workers. Now, during this time, the hospital purchased the Ziegler farm adjacent to the hospital grounds. This would later house many important and large-scale buildings on the campus, while the farmhouse was converted into a staff house. The hospital began to construct several new buildings to alleviate the overcrowding beginning to rear its ugly head again. A TB ward was constructed along with Inwood Hall and a new acute hospital. The psychopathic building was designed to take in citizens who voluntarily wanted treatment but didn't want the stigma or imprisonment included with regular commitment. The hospital library and Edgewood Hall would be built soon afterward. Patients admitted to the hospital during the first half of the 20th century came from all walks of life. They followed a routine schedule put together by the staff, which included many activities such as sports, entertainment, and exercise. They were treated with occupational therapies which would develop in the early years of the hospital. On special occasions, patients were taken out on sailing trips along the Hudson, or marketplaces were set up at the hospital for patients to sell their crafts. Many strange cases were committed to the hospital. Notably, one woman was sent to Hudson River after she decapitated her 2 children. An ex-soldier suffering from PTSD lived in a cave for 10 years and couldn't communicate through anything other than animal noises. One patient apparently went insane after being hit with a snowball. The list of strange cases is long and honestly very depressing. In 1917, Hudson River State Hospital, Dr. Pilgrim retired from his position as superintendent after 23 very influential years. He was succeeded by Dr. Walter G. Ryan, a medical inspector from the State Hospital Commission. The biggest issue on Dr. Ryan's plate was our old friend overcrowding. Hudson River State Hospital had a whopping 3,500 patients when its capacity was only designated to be 2,800 patients. The hospital acquired 105 acres of the 1,000 total acre Camp Whitman, a World War I mobilization camp. They constructed a dairy farm along with new buildings for chronic women patients and amusement activities. New tuberculosis wards were added during this time as well. A huge advancement for women was made in May of 1920 when a bill was passed increasing women state hospital workers' wages by 100%. By this time, the Hudson River State Hospital had over 890 acres of property. Throughout the rest of the first half of the 20th century, the hospital found itself going through high-ranking administrators and superintendents at a fairly consistent pace. This trend began with Dr. Clarence Cheney. Dr. Cheney would continue the quest for reduction of overcrowding, something that Hudson River State Hospital was constantly fighting. In 1929, for example, the capacity of the hospital was 3,338 patients. This was considerably large for a state hospital at the time, considering they were still 20% over that limit with 418 patients admitted. This left hundreds of patients sleeping on the floor of the various wards. By 1931, Dr. Cheney proposed the construction of 7 additional buildings to try to contain the overcrowding at the hospital. Dr. Folsom took over Cheney's place in 1932, taking over his predecessor's building projects and opening several key structures, such as additional staff housing as well as Ryan Hall, designed to hold the criminally insane brought into the hospital. Along with these key structures, other less notable utility structures were constructed under Dr. Folsom. Dr. Folsom was also the superintendent to introduce insulin therapy at the hospital in 1938, a practice that involved the injection of large doses of insulin into the patient. This would cause a coma in the patient for several weeks and was thought to cure schizophrenia. Right. Dr. Ryan was replaced by Dr. Ross in 1941. While the Second World War was ramping up in the United States, there were many people who objected to the United States entering the conflict. It just so happened that many state hospitals at the time were short on staff, including Hudson River State Hospital. These war objectors were sent to work at the facility, with 25 assigned in 1945. This ultimately led to what is now known as the Ryan Hall incident. It was reported that 4 attendants who worked in Ryan Hall were mistreating and outright abusing the patients. When reported to Dr. Ross, he dismissed them before the governor could even request a full investigation of the conditions at the hospital. Now, 3 of these attendants who were let go were actually part of a workers' union who worked to bring mainstream news attention to the incident and painted the hospital and its superintendent in a harsh light. They also claimed that Dr. Ross made several off-color remarks about the staff and patients. By 1948, Dr. Ross had resigned his position. He was succeeded by Dr. Wirt Groom. Groom was only a short-term replacement, as he was assistant director before taking over for Dr. Ross. However, his construction projects left a major footprint on the campus of the hospital, not seen since the construction of the Kirkbride building itself. In 1949, a 9-story tower with 24 patient wards and 960 beds was proposed. It was named in honor of the late Dr. Clarence Cheney. Completed in 1952, the structure cost over $9 million to build, and the first tenant was the hospital's School of Nursing. By this time, Dr. Groom had already been replaced by Dr. O. Arnold Kilpatrick. Kilpatrick fought strongly against workers' unions and tried to use patients for construction work around the hospital grounds. He argued that it was part of the hospital's occupational treatment. This ultimately caused a walkout and seized the construction projects at the hospital by the government of New York. During this period, an NBC news crew was allowed to tour the grounds of the hospital for television to show the progress of medical treatment. By 1955, the hospital had reached its peak population at an incredible 6,000 patients on campus. In 1956, they began the pilot program to study the effect of outpatient treatment programs and day hospitals. This was an incredibly innovative approach that would ultimately lead to the downfall of institutionalization together. In keeping with the modernizations during the time, the hospital ended the cruel and inhumane lobotomies and hydrotherapy in 1957. With the death of Dr. Kilpatrick in 1957, Dr. Robert Hunt took the reins of the Hudson River State Hospital. He continued in his predecessor's footsteps by increasing the intensive care units at the hospital inside the Cheney building. Dr. Hunt also pushed for further innovation in care and initiated another pilot program. This program essentially entailed that psychiatric services be given to the residents of the surrounding area and tried to prove if it were possible to treat mental illness without being committed to a hospital, such as Hudson River. Dr. Hunt wanted to fight the stigma in America that people with mental illness immediately needed to be put into the state hospital system. These innovations programs would begin to pick up traction not only in other institutions, but in the minds of the people and politicians. During Dr. Hunt's tenure, his administration opened the Children's Hillcrest Academy. I want to make a special note of this section of the hospital due to its unacceptable, intense cruelty towards children, and to make it clear that while our mental health system was taking steps forward, it was also taking steps backwards. Now, Hillcrest was designed to be an educational facility for children aged 6 to 10 with mental disabilities. They believed that they could help children at a young age return to normal society. This ideal was only a thin facade for the terrible conditions these children were put through. It was more of a prison than a school, and the staff reportedly kept the building incredibly warm between 80 and 85 degrees Fahrenheit. The staff claimed that this was to keep the patients lethargic and fatigued. The treatment of these children is completely appalling, and just one of the dark details sometimes left out of the overall history of these massive institutions. By the 1960s, treatment towards the mentally ill was beginning to change further, and with it, a new superintendent was brought in, with Dr. Herman Snow taking over in 1961. Dr. Snow challenged the established methods of care and treatment towards the patients. He put an open-door policy in place for patients, allowing them to travel throughout the hospital freely. He wanted to get rid of the prison-like bars and locked doors in his hospital. He also wanted to be very open and honest with the public, regularly holding discussions and panels to go over treatments and care of the mentally ill. Under Dr. Snow, the hospital began the planning of a state-of-the-art recreation and rehabilitation center. This is important to mention, as this was the beginning of the decline of state hospitals like Hudson River as the deinstitutionalization began to take effect. With this, the patient population began to slowly shrink, so the construction of a brand new facility was not only ambitious, but showed the influence of the facility on New York State and Dutchess County. With the new rehab center opening in 1971, the hospital began to reopen some of its shuttered facilities throughout the early 70s. These buildings were designed to work as community living centers for smaller amounts of patients and staff. In 1974, the hospital would change its name for the final time in an effort to show it was evolving with the times. The new name was the Hudson River Psychiatric Center. This new name kicked off a sharp decline in the hospital's population as deinstitutionalization began to take effect. In 1974 was the final year of the school's nursing program would accept incoming students, with that class graduating in 1977. This ended the school's 91-year run. Hillcrest Academy would shutter a year later. The Kirkbride building's two patient wings began to clean out in 1975 and were completely empty by 1979. This was not only because of the lack of population, but because the ornate and expensive pine floors the original administration so desperately needed began to become unstable from years of neglect. By 1984, the hospital's patient count was down to around 900, drastically down from the 6,000 patients just a few decades earlier. The hospital attempted to have the wings demolished, however there was fierce opposition by locals and historical associations. The discussion was shelved until a section of the south wing floor collapsed and caused steam pipes to be shut off. This prompted new discussion about demolition, however they ran into the issue of how to reroute the piping. Utility companies refused to work inside the damaged building, and the state seemed to deem the structure too expensive to effectively mothball, with heating costing around $250,000 a year. By this time it had been 10 years of decay inside the structures, and the state would only appoint small amounts of money for patch jobs to keep the roof intact. The determination of locals and historical societies did make a major victory in 1989, with the building being deemed a National Historic Landmark. However, this designation only applied to the Center Administration Building, but was enough to diminish the immediate threats of demolition. Throughout all of this constant debate and threat of demolition, the Administration Building continued to operate during this period as hospital offices. The 1990s saw a continued decline in patient population and the closure of more buildings. The Harlem Valley Psychiatric Center was shuttered in 1994 and its remaining assets were consolidated into Hudson River State. During this time, the property was split up into the upper and lower campus, with the upper consisting of much smaller buildings farther from the river and the lower being home to the more notable structures like the Cheney Building, Ryan Hall, and of course the Kirkbride. The lower campus continued to lose its patient population during this time. The Cheney Building was shuttered in 2000 and all patients were moved to the smaller Ross Pavilion. The administration office continued to run out of the Kirkbride until operations officially ceased in 2001. The upper campus would continue to operate until January 25th of 2012, officially killing the hospital as it merged with the Rockland Psychiatric Center just across the river. With its purpose lost, the lower campus sat abandoned for almost 20 years. The property was initially owned by the state-run Empire State Development Group after the shutdown. However, it was sold in 2005 to Hudson Heritage LLC. This company wanted to redevelop the property and the existing buildings. However, work was slow and for years the facility continued to deteriorate. Now, the Kirkbride was already placed on the National Trust of Historic Places Most Endangered Landmarks list the year prior. However, this was nothing compared to the devastation that would soon shake the abandoned institution. In 2006, Hudson Heritage did invest some money into the property, in particular reinforcing the roof of the Kirkbride building, as well as cleaning up the overgrowth around the hospital. This effort turned out to be fruitless, however. In 2007, a massive fire broke out in the south wing of the Kirkbride, essentially ending any reasonable chance of its preservation. It was deemed that the fire was caused by a lightning strike. By March of the next year, Hudson Heritage had given up on its plans of redevelopment and sold the property to CPC Resources. CPC took Hudson Heritage's initial redevelopment plan and added even more development onto the site, including 350,000 square feet of retail. CPC confirmed at the time that the beyond repair south wing would be demolished. Almost as quickly as they acquired the property, CPC gave up their redevelopment effort and put the property up for sale in April 2012 for $14 million. I think it's worth mentioning just how quickly the Kirkbride was deteriorating during this time. In many cases, Kirkbrides have sat abandoned for decades with little more than cosmetic and water damage. This was child's play compared to the damage done at Hudson River State Hospital. Floors were collapsing, walls crumbling, and roofs caving in on themselves. It was as if the building was sitting abandoned for almost a century. Now, Walmart was supposed to be interested in the property, however, the town of Poughkeepsie shot down any proposal by the company because they believed the property was far too large for a single Walmart store. In 2013, however, the property was sold to a partnership between Enviro Finance Group and Diversified Realty Advisors. It took 2 years for the new owners to come up with a new development proposal, and during this time the buildings continued to deteriorate at an alarming rate. When the plan was completed, it was incredibly alarming to preservationists. Almost every building on the site, including massive structures like the Cheney Building, Ryan Hall, and the Rehabilitation Center, were slated for demolition. The owners claimed that the property was, and I quote, ruined, contaminated with lead and asbestos, too costly to adapt to anything, functionally obsolete, or just in the wrong place for any economically feasible private sector development. The Kirkbride, or at least the administration building, was planned but not confirmed for restoration, along with a handful of other buildings such as the chapel and the director's house. This was all put in jeopardy by another tragic fire in April of 2018. This time to the administration building. It chewed through the roof of the 150-year-old structure and left preservationists devastated. It is thought that the fire was started by an arsonist, and to too many, this confirmed the fear that the entire Kirkbride would be lost. By 2019, the excessive vegetation was removed from the property, letting the surrounding area get a glimpse of the property for the first time in years. Ryan Hall was the first major structure to be demolished, with the Rehabilitation Center coming soon after, as well as the Cheney Building. Remarkably, the administration building of the Kirkbride, although badly damaged, was confirmed for restoration, with a new roof being built throughout 2020. It is planned to be a mixed-use development, education, and arts center. As of 2021, the entire Kirkbride is still standing, with the wing's future still unknown. The developers have confirmed that not only are they incorporating architectural elements and salvage from the original buildings into the new construction, but also all demolished buildings will have their materials recycled. Frederick Law Olmsted's landscaping elements such as the Great Lawn are also being restored, returning the iconic view of the sweeping hill with the administration building at its peak back to the people of Dutchess County. The story of the Hudson River State Hospital is incredibly fascinating and unique to me, even compared to the countless other institutions that ultimately ended up down the same path. That all lies in the bizarre case of bad luck that seemed to haunt the hospital literally from its inception. Mismanagement, cost overruns, controversy after controversy, it seemed like the world was truly out to get this facility. Even in abandonment, the hospital struggled to find a buyer, caught fire on numerous occasions, and decayed at a rapid pace. But through all of this, the facility not only survived, but thrived through its 141 years of operation. It made important and progressive strides in mental health, some of which contributed to its own demise. Instead of allowing overcrowding to take over, Hudson River State Hospital expanded aggressively to try to keep as many patients as they could in a bed, ultimately accumulating 111 buildings. The institution was truly massive even for a state hospital. They encouraged the open door policy, occupational treatment as well, and fought to keep patients out of poorhouses and prisons. Was the hospital perfect? Far from it. The development of hydrotherapy was cruel, and of course the use of lobotomies was inhumane, among other treatments. However, these were products of the time, and luckily we've moved past these barbaric treatment methods. The hospital did try to evolve during its later years, however it was way too little, way too late, with deinstitutionalization already sweeping the nation. The hospital held out for longer than others though, considering it only officially shut down in 2012. At least after its demise, the property has found a developer that seems to care for its history and wants to preserve as much as they can of the historic campus, considering how truly destroyed the property was after its abandonment. Hudson River State Hospital was not only an institution, but it was a constant in the Hudson Valley. It was a troubled place that no doubt had its extreme highs and extreme lows, but to the thousands of patients and staff who lived and worked there, for better or for worse, it was their home. I'd like to thank everybody for sitting through my spiel of almost 27 minutes now in the Hudson River State Hospital. This is a topic that I didn't realize had such a interesting and bizarre history until I really dug into it for this video, and it's made me love the place even more. I really hope that everyone enjoyed and learned a lot, because I know I did researching this topic. I don't know when the next episode will be out, but I'll see you guys then.